having that conversation that can lead to a lot of problems.
Okay, well, so look, fair enough on all fronts. And let me address those points one by one. We'll get back to the identification with the universe notion here in a moment. But on the I'm afraid of organized religion front, look.
Wary.
One of the things hey man, fair enough. And I think that's the evil uncle problem, is that like every organized social unit has a proclivity to degenerate into a willfully blind tyranny. And that's part of the existential reality of mankind. Now, one of the things I've observed about Harris and Dawkins, and this is particularly true of Sam Harris, is that Harris is very concerned with the problem of evil, and validly so, and deeply so. He's committed his life to it, and he would like to establish an objective morality. And the reason he would like to do that is because he believes in the reality of the objective, and he also believes in the necessity of the moral because he's concerned with evil. And so, I'm kind of on board with that, which is why Sam and I really actually can talk. But the problem that Sam has conceptually, as far as I'm concerned, is that he identifies the religious enterprise with the totalitarian spirit. And that's the same mistake the postmodernists make when they identify Western culture with the patriarchy. It's like, look, it is the case that large-scale systems can ossify, become willfully blind, and degenerate into tyranny. But that doesn't mean that that's their central animating spirit. Now, you see the same thing with the 1619 Project in the United States. This claim that the fundamental foundation, so animating spirit, that drove the formulation of the United States was the tyrannical desire to dominate, oppress, and enslave. And you have to say, well, let's give the devil his due. Every human organization tilts towards corruption by power. But that doesn't mean that's the central animating spirit. And so I would say, well, the same thing applies on the religious front. Like, my sense is, and we can certainly discuss this, is that, and this is really useful to think about in relationship to Wilberforce. So he was a Christian Protestant operating in Britain, and he, in many ways, single-handedly forced the British Empire to not only abandon slavery, but to oppose it on the world seas for 175 years. And he did that in 100% as a consequence of being animated by the spirit of Protestant liberalism. And that was a consequence of the dissemination and distribution of the Bible, because the idea was human beings are made in the image of God, and slavery is wrong, period. That's a transcendent truth, and economic rationale be damned, there's no excuse for it. And so I think the problem with the skepticism that you're expressing in relationship to the religious enterprise is that it doesn't sufficiently separate the wheat from the chaff.
I see what you're saying, but we're not disagreeing, because let me take you back to the beginning of this conversation when I did say to you that I believe religion is useful, right? And I'm fond of, I can't remember who said this, but someone said that the poor believe religion is true, the middle class believes it's false, and the rich believe it's useful, or the powerful believe it's useful. I'm not powerful or rich, but I certainly consider it useful, and I can see that the lack of it has its negative impact as well. I just don't wish to submit myself to a rigid ideology of that kind, combined with the fact I don't believe in the big guy in the sky, right?
Okay, so let's not make it, okay, so let's agree that you shouldn't subordinate yourself arbitrarily to a rigid structure. Now, you might want to do that sporadically to discipline yourself, right? But the object shouldn't be submission. Now, what's weird in the biblical narrative, is that the goal is not submission. It's so weird. It's covenantal relationship. And covenantal relationship is actually relationship. So one of the things you see with Moses, for example, and you also see this with Abraham, is that they're constantly negotiating with God. That's why the name of my next book, by the way, is We Who Wrestle with God. It's a negotiation. It's not a submission. And so God is always threatening to wipe out the Israelites in the desert. He's just sick and tired of their idol worship and their whiny resentment and their bitterness and their worship of the past tyranny. And he's constantly threatening just to wipe them out and start again. And that's the apocalypse, I suppose. And Moses is constantly interceding on their behalf and telling God he shouldn't break his word. And the odd thing in the story is that God actually listens, which is rather preposterous. But the reason that's happening is to mitigate against exactly the problem that you described, which is to have the relationship with the transcendent degenerate into nothing but a blind obedience. And then the danger of that is, well, a blind obedience to who? And I see this as a threat in Islam, in the more fundamentalist forms of Islam. It's like, well, you should submit to Allah. It's like, hey, fair enough. Allah as interpreted by who? Oh, totalitarian, misogynistic mullahs. How about no? I don't buy your Allah, and I don't see who made you the right, precisely.
And even if I believed in the bearded guy in the sky, I'm not sure I need a middleman to talk to him. Right.
Well, that makes you a good Protestant. You know?
Well,
but look, we could also go down that rabbit hole a little bit, you know, and it's worth it, because I also think this is how we ended up in this postmodern excess liberal conundrum. So Jung talked about Catholicism, as we mentioned, and he talked about the utility of and mercy of the confessional and that possibility of atonement. But he also laid out, you know, the dangers of that. The dangers of the Catholic structure is, what would you say, a tilt towards authoritarian rigidity, which is what the Protestants rebelled against. But then the question is, well, what's the danger of the Protestant Revolution? And the danger is that everybody becomes his own church. And then here's the problem. You tell me what you think about this. Here's the logical conclusion of that. You're your own church. You're your own God. Now you can say what God said to Moses out of the depths of the burning bush. You can say, I am what I am. And I would say that's what the identity politics types do. They say, look, I am so superordinate in my own self-defining identity that no matter what identity claim I put forward, it is incumbent upon you to accept it as if it comes from an omniscient source. And I think, as far as I can tell, Constantine, that's where we are, right? Increasingly by force of law. If you make an identity claim, no matter how preposterous, which implies that there's some limit to identity claims, by the way, like I have to accept, well, there's one example in Ontario right now that's become famous for its surreality. So there's a female teacher in a suburb in Toronto who has decided at the ripe old age of something approximating 50 that he's actually a woman,